Noxian Short Story, Sisterhood of War, Part 1, Old Wounds, by Ian St. Martin.
Is anything you just heard unclear? Tifalengi knelt in darkness. She did not raise her head to the voice addressing her, because the voice was part of the darkness. It filled the chamber, swirling warm and sickly sweet, with a scent like rotting flowers. Such a thing was not particularly remarkable to one whose life was sworn to the weft and wane of runes. Even a smith as young as Tifalengi did not question what surrounded her. Now, she knew when to accept that something was beyond her understanding. "All is clear," she answered. "Excellent." The darkness rasped, as though drawing in breath. "Your mistress spoke highly of you. Resourceful." It spoke the word in another voice, the voice of Tifalengi's teacher. "And those who are resourceful can be of great use." Tifalengi swallowed. She felt the air displace, the temperature rise as though the chamber were now filled with people. Daring to look out of the corner of her eye, she saw a hem of robed figures lining the walls, ringing her in the source of her voice. "Watch the moon!" Suddenly there was a pulse of light reflecting cold and silver against the floor. "See it course, how it turns." Her mind raced, considering what lay ahead, the moments available to her spilling away one by one, like grains of sand from an hourglass. "Remember your task above all else." A hand extended from the dark, cupping Tifalengi's chin. "What we have entrusted you to find, to return to us, cannot be replaced." The hand lifted Tifalengi's head, and she looked up into a perfect reflection of her own face, grinning with another person's smile. "You, however, can be." Erath was the son of Noxus, from the first generation of his tribe to be born into the Empire. Training had begun the day he took his first steps. Fortitude, discipline, resolve. He was raised among shepherds, tending flocks of beasts of burdens, keeping them well until time for harvest came. He learned to kill quickly and cleanly with the small knife he had been taught to never let leave his side. It was a lesson that would do him credit when the day came that Noxus would call upon him to serve. He had been taught to kill his enemies, his empire's enemy, but never to hate them, because an enemy of the empire was never more than a ceremony away from being a wayworn brother or sister brought forth with honor and purpose into the arms of Noxus to stand beside Erath in the line to make him stronger. "Kill them until they're family," his father had once told him when he showed Erath the dull purple trail of his old campaign scars. Erath had never hated his enemy, but here, looking around the scope of what surrounded him, without even knowing who their enemy was, he pitied them. The streets quake with an endless procession, tens of thousands of soldiers passing down the boulevards and avenues of the Immortal Bastion, a dozen tongues overlapping in a primal shouting rhythm of the battle charms, marching calls, and war songs. The full unbridled might of the Noxus host was on display, with blades and the hand that wielded them from across the breadth of the empire. Tribal war parties thundered down the roads, clad in skins and ceremonially dressed, followed by tightly regimented cohorts of troops encased in blackened iron plates, and a contingent of brightly uniformed naval soldiers from Shurima. And more after them, and on and on. Countless people, but a single empire. The spectacle of sheer demonstration of strength stilled Erath's heart to see it. Erath's own tribe was in the midst from disembarking from the riverboats that had ferried them down the plains of Dalamor, down south to the capital. He and his comrade had marveled over their oars at the sight of the Immortal Bastion, the towering central monolith of ancient stone, visible 2 days from their arrival. He looked up from watching his chieftain Yawin scrabble with a gaggle of quartermasters to behold it again, now within the boundaries of the cities proper. The sun was trapped behind the trio of enormous tower at the center of the bastion, locked away like a shining jewel. The thought of their unknown enemy returned to Erath's mind, and he smiled. What could stand before this? Donis, one of the spearmen, nudged Erath from his thoughts. nodding towards the chieftain who was beckoning Erath over. He quickly moved to stand before Yawin, who had just been handed a realm of vellum inked with their orders. "We move soon." Yawin began, speaking in their tribal tongue as he looked over their mandate. "Have they said where the fighting will be yet?" asked Erath, letting his excitement get the better of him. "No." Yern frowned, squinting at the Noxian scribe before looking at the boy. "But it won't matter to you. You won't be coming with us." "I don't understand." Erath adopted his chieftain's frown. "I am to be your blade squire." Erath had won the honor in the blood trials before the tribe departed home. It was Erath's right to bear Yawin's war gear on the battle train, to hone and oil his relic blade on the eve of battle, to arm his chieftain and bind his wounds, and should calamity pass, to see to Yawin's body if he fell. If not Erath, then who? "You shall be a blade squire indeed," said Yawin, "just not mine. You have been seconds elsewhere." He sensed the confusion in Erath, and his tone hardened. "For Noxus." Erath straightened, pushing the question from his thoughts, his features neutral and firm as he thudded a fist against his chest in salute. "For the Empire!" Yawin returned the salute and dipped his head in approval. "We shall all answer when called. Blade sharps, minds ready." With a deep breath, Erath put his disappointment out of his mind. "I am ready." "He would see you this day and feel pride. I know it." Erath glared down for a moment, and Yawin handed him a small scroll, sealed and tightly rolled. "Proceed to the 9th gate of the Bastion, across the canal just ahead of us. The Legionnaires will stop you. Show them this." Even a mention of the Trifarran Legion made Erath stand straighter. He studied the scroll, brightly bleached paper, compared to the wrought vellum of his brethren's mandate. He had never seen paper before. It felt delicate in his fingers. "It seems fate has its own course for you to walk in Hashi." Yahweh favored Erath with a tribal expression for a warrior poised to make his mark on the warpath. He laid a scarred paw of a hand on Erath's shoulder before sending him on his way. "Walk it well." Erath navigating the bustling throng of a city readying itself for war. For a boy raised in a lowly shepherd village, the scale of everything was astounding. Towering monuments and buildings of stone, iron and glass looming over streets once smoothed by armies marching to the next campaign. Erath moved along the current of humanity, barely able to lift his arm within the crowd. He had never considered there could be so many people, so many languages. It was nearly overwhelming, but he kept his mind to his duty. Few from the tribe were learned in Noxian, but Erath knew a passable amount of Va Noxian, the unified spoken tongue, and a partly understanding of the Empire's formal written language. He knew enough to guess the sign and engravings to guide him along towards the 9th gate, just up ahead, where he was to report to his new commander. Shouldering the sackcloth holding his kit, Erath reached into his jerkin, passing over the bone pendant he wore around his neck. He laid a reassuring hand on the paten for a moment before touching his order inscribed on a tightly rolled sheet of bleached paper. The value of the tiny thing made his mind race as to who his new leader would be, and how important their mission. He was so lost in thought he didn't notice falling under a pair of towering shadows cast over the courtyard of the gate. "Kosesjivia!" A sharp clash of iron froze Erath in place. He looked up from the ground, finding himself staring down the gleaming edges of twin halberds, each longer than he was tall, and level at his heart. Wielding the spears were monsters of blackened iron plate, cape, the hue of flesh blood billowing from their shoulders, glowering down at him from the impressive mask of spiked war helms. Erath's breath caught in his throat. Trifarran Legionnaires. He noticed then the gates weren't barred. The two of the Noxian warriors lead, they were the boss. The challenge repeated, thundering from one of the Legionnaires, somehow deepened and projected to an inhuman degree by his mask. The words were unfamiliar, thick with a strange dialect. Was it Va Noxian? Erath squinted, remembering what he had learned. The warrior tilted his head, clearing his throat, with a sound like rubble dislodging. "Where go, little blade?" The Legionnaire rumbled again, in more clipped tones. Erath exhaled, like a drowning man finally reaching the water's surface, able to understand the words. Still,
His tongue defied him. Thick and still behind teeth, he desperately fought to keep from chattering. Slowly, he reached into his jerkin, winced as he saw the legionnaires tense, and produced the scroll. The warriors exchanged a glance, and one of them, the one who had spoken, shouldered his halberd. He advanced on Erath with heavy pounding boot steps, stopping just a pace away from the boy. Erath looked up, barely reaching the man's chest, and held out his order. The legionnaire plucked the scroll from Erath's grasp, the paper looking ridiculously in his thick, gauntlet fingers. With a quick squeeze, he crushed the seal in his fist, and the scroll unspooled in a small shower of broken bits of red wax. After studying it for a moment, the legionnaire spun on his heel and hammered the butt of his halberd 3 times against the polished stone floor, the boom of each impact ringing from the dark archway of the gate. Within seconds, Erath heard the soft, echoing slaps of sandaled feet approaching. A robed figure emerged from the darkness of the gate, her features hidden in the shadow of a red cowl. She stopped before the legionnaire, completely unfazed by his menacing armored bulk, and took the scroll from him. "You will follow me," she said to Erath without sparing him a glance, turning and setting off across the courtyard. Erath hurried after her, looking back over his shoulder to watch the legionnaires plop back to his place beside his fellow guard. Erath followed the robed woman as they crossed over another canal and wandered deeper into the bustling city. They kept to side streets, avoiding the large boulevards packed with troop movements and hemmed by rows of barrack tents arrayed on either side. Before long, Erath picked up a strong scent on the air. Straw, cut grass, dung. Smells that were familiar to any shepherd or beast herder. He heard the low baying of animals. Some he recognized, many he did not. The narrow alley they were walking ended up opening into a wide open square filled with people tending animals. Massive pack beasts grazed on confined plots. Men and women checked pens of sheep and counted chickens in their coop. It seemed to Erath as though the area had served some other purpose. Maybe as a park or public garden, but now has been requisitioned and was being used as a part of the great mobilization. The comfort of familiarity washed over Erath, setting his mind at ease as they stopped before a tent at the periphery of the square. The robed woman returned the scroll to Erath and pulling the flap aside, gesturing him to enter and disappearing as soon as he had. Inside the tent, the air was cold and thick with the spicy tang of incense that made Erath's eye water. He wrinkled his nose as he stood at the entrance, squinting to try to study the interior. The only light came from a kneeling figure at the center of the tent, her arms waving a strand of glowing green runes around a sword that hung suspended in the air above her. Erath watched the magic, entranced by the elegant dance of the runes as they burned themselves into the blade of the sword and vanished one by one. He remembered watching the shamans of his tribe as a child, where they turned the air into fire for their rituals. He avoided staring directly at the symbols, as even out of the corner of his eye they made his teeth itch. The woman turned her head slightly as the last rune winged out, catching her blade as it fell, and rising to her feet. "Reporting for duty!" Erath snapped to attention and saluted. He extended the scroll to her. "My orders!" The woman ignored him, moving as through a trance to set her blade on the arming rack. She lit a lantern in the center of the tent, bathing them both in soft amber light. She was tall, her dusky skin speaking of a home far from the chill northern regions Ethan hailed from. He saw the same green light from the runes flicker once in her eyes as she glared at him. "Literate." Erath hesitated. Her Noxian has a lilting, mellifluous accent, far different from the crude and guttural voices he had heard so far in the capital. The woman's eye narrowed. "You are literate?" she asked again. She looked either fatigued or bored, and Erath couldn't tell which. Erath nodded. "I know some of the written words, mistress." "Did you read this?" she asked, holding up the scroll Erath realized was no longer in his hand. "No, mistress." Erath shook his head. "Good," she said sharply, tucking the roll of paper into her sleeve. "I am Tifalenchi, and from this moment on, my word is law to you. Read, think, and do what I say when I say, and much unpleasantness will be avoided between us. Do you understand?" Erath saluted again. "Yes, mistress." "Once we are clear of the capital, there will be no more saluting." Tifalenchi took up a ledger from the table, thumbing through the content. "May I ask a question, mistress?" She looked up.
Do not make a habit of it.
How may I serve? Erath asked. What are to be my duties? Tifalenchi snapped the lecture shut.
I needed someone vast in the care and upkeep of beasts, young and hardy in their stock. You are from the plains of Dalamor, yes?
Yes, mistress. He fought to keep anger from its voice. He had nearly had to kill his cousin to win the blood trial and become his chieftain's second, and now he's back to tending beast. I was a shepherd there. She offered him a thin smile, and Erath swore he could hear something snarling behind him, just within earshot.
The creatures under your care here may be more exotic.
The flap of the tent was thrown open in a snap of whipping canvas. Erath turned his head, immediately on the grip of his knife.
I wouldn't,
said Tifalenchi, as Erath discovered the source of the snarling. 4 drakehound lined the entrance to the tent, sleek beasts of taunt ribble muscle, bony carapace, and razor-sharp claws. Erath was told stories as a boy of when the tribes of the plains were brought into the empire, that the chief of chiefs had been honored with a single drakehound pup, a gift worth more than 3 wagons of silver. He had never seen one up close, let alone a whole pack of them. A woman in gleaming warplate stood behind them, glowering from behind an armored mask. Her hair was a stunning crimson red, bound at the top of her head and flowing like a crest down her back. The hounds parted as she stepped forward into the tent, a pair to either side.
Errol,
Tifalenchi inclined her head.
You made good time, tracker.
Erath beheld Errol, still unable to imagine someone owning 4 drakehounds. Are you of the nobility, mistress? Errol flickered her eye to Erath, as grey and cold as her armor, then back to Tifalenchi.
Our blade squire, said Tifalenchi to Errol before looking at Erath. We don't send the nobility to Tokogol.
The western frontier, said Erath.
How did you find Tokogol, mistress?
Cold, Errol grumbled. Her voice was slow, her accent severe.
I see, Erath nodded. And your journey here?
Long. Errol glanced back at Tifalenchi. Does it always talk this much?
Erath startled. Have I displeased you, mistress?
4th, Ariel called. One of the drakehounds snapped forward from Ariel's side, placing itself between Erath, barely restraining violence radiating from the beast's muscled frame. Thin strands of saliva descended from its bony mask, pebbled with froth from a growling throat. If you had displeased me, Blade Squire, said Ariel, this hound would have made it known to you, and I am not your mistress.
Forgiveness. Erath took a slow step back. How would you have me address you then?
Unless necessary, I would have that you not. She tensed, as though speaking this much had made her throat sore. She flicked her wrist, signaling an end to the discussion.
There's a quartermaster outside gathering our supplies, said Tifalenchi, handing Erath a requisition order. Go and find him.
Erath exhaled, walking carefully around Errol and her hounds to exit the tent. He heard Errol ask a question as he left, the same one he's still asking himself. Why am I here, runesmith? Never seen a basilisk before, eh boy? Erath barely heard the quartermaster, his attention consumed by the great lumbering beast before him. A giant saurian, the basilisk's green flesh was hard as iron and bulging with bands of dense muscle from its tree-trunk limbs to its long thick tail. It looked to Erath it could crush a man into a paste without even realizing it had done so. What are you used to tending? The quartermaster asked. Sheep, Erath answered. Don't fret. The quartermaster clapped Erath on the back. Just think of him like a big sheep then. He's still a baby, so you'll be fine with him. Time hasn't made him mean yet. This, Erath looked at the man. It's a baby? The quartermaster chuckled. We used the biggins to break down castle walls, son. Erath glanced down at the requisition order the runesmith had given him. Mercifully, it was written in plain terms, mostly numbers, and the quartermaster had helped him with anything he couldn't understand. The basilisk would be carrying the better part of the entire campsite on its back, but it looked like they were carrying much more equipment than would be needed for 3 people, even with Errol's drakehounds. Everything in order. Tifalenchi appeared behind Erath. He noticed she was fully armored now, with her rune-edged sword on her back and a canvas rucksack at her feet. We're getting him squared away, replied the quartermaster. Most everything but the water skins are loaded. We'll be taking care of that next, and you'll be on your way.
Good, said the runesmith, checking the height of the sun. We'll link with the caravan leaving out of the south entrance. We need to be on the road and clear of the city before sunfall. The road? Erath asked. Ever since he arrived at the capital, Erath had watched the armies and warbands of Noxus, including his own tribe, march and embark on great troop ships at the docks. We won't be traveling with the others across the sea? The runesmith shook her head. No, we aren't finished on the mainland yet. There's still someone we need to find first. They left the organized chaos of the capital behind. Towering silhouette of the Immortal Bastion lingered on the horizon, as Erath, Errol, and Tifalengi joined a massive procession of troops moving east across the southern steppes of Noxus. Like a gargantuan snake of red banners and dark iron, they marched, traversing flat plains that reminded Erath of his home back in Dalamor.
There's just too many of us,
a grizzled line sergeant had told Erath, waiting in the ration line as they camped one night.
The capital docks are huge and they could run them day and night, and they are, and it still wouldn't be enough for the full mobilization.
That's why we're going east? Erath asked. The sergeant grunted, smiling at his beaten tin cup as it was filled with stew and a hunk of hard brown bread.
While the rest of them get to share a damn boat's innards with some rats for company, we get to stretch our legs a bit before we split off and burst across the coast.
And then where? Erath nodded his thanks to the cook as he received his own portion. Where are all of us going?
Nobody told you?
The line sergeant scoffed.
We're going to Ionia, boy.
Erath stumbled to a halt, his food nearly falling from numb fingers. He felt for his chest, finding the lump of the pendant he wore. Ionia.
You're holding up the line.
The sergeant frowned at him. The last time, Erath said quietly, the war. The Empire levied half the men of my tribe to go fight. He looked up at the sergeant. None of them came back.
Sounds like you're gonna get a chance to get some blood back.
The sergeant pulled the collar of his tunic down, revealing a wicked red scar that branched like lightning across his entire chest.
Magic. A lot of us got scores to settle over there, kid, and we've been patient. Now it's time to collect.
Erath offered the sergeant a thin smile he didn't feel, and wandered back to his billet, suddenly not feeling hungry anymore. The march continued on, brisk and uneventful. As the days went on, more segments of the battle train branched off, heading to ports they were assigned to deploy from. Erath continued to feel isolated from his company, the runesmith Tifalengi aloof, and Errol hostile. So he focused instead on what he had been seconded from his tribe to do, and cared for the party's hulking basilisk. Despite the creature's immense size and strength, the quartermaster back at the capital had been right. Erath found him docile and receptive to his care, something he hoped would extend to Errol's drakehounds, though he didn't hang too much hope on that. The pack practically orbiting the armored Noxian at all times, totally obedient to their alpha. Erath had taken to call him the Basilisk Tals, the name of his old herding dog when he had been a boy. The lumbering Surrend responded to his new name as Erath led him to gaze and kept him in line with the convoy. A week into the journey, the runesmith gathered the party, announcing that while the main body was continuing east, they would be taking their own path down the southern branch. We make for the Blood Cliffs, said Tifalengi, as Erath watched the convoy slowly shrink in the distance. Still an unbroken column of Noxian warriors marching to the coast. What's there? He asked. Not what, answered the runesmith, but who? Erath nodded, remembering Tifalengi had mentioned someone else before. He looked back at the extra supply, loaded onto Tal's back. Who is it?
A haughty canard,
scoffed Errol, pouring water from a flask into her palm to allow her hounds to drink. First ears perked up at the word, which Erath didn't know, but he could guess as to its meaning. Errol sneered at Tifalengi.
We are wasting our time. We don't need her.
I'll be the reckoner of that, the runesmith replied flatly. She glanced at Erath and sighed through her teeth. Her name is Merit, Bladesquire.
Merit's quite keen on reminding anyone within earshot that she was of the nobility before the revolution, grumbled Errol. They stripped their family of their estate and power, though she hardly seems to realize that from talking to her.
Errol scanned the landscape.
She went on and on about these wondrous land her family held. She shook her head. What a shithole.
She is an elite soldier, countered Tifalengi, experienced and battle-tested. She will be an asset, and that is the end of this conversation. The road to the Blood Cliffs cut through arid plains and low, sun-baked hills. The heat was a new experience for Erath, far from the fog-blanket chill of Dalamor. He took care to ration what water they had
as they traveled beneath the glaring sun in a cloudless, blistering blue sky. Errol paused, and Erath patted Tal's flank to bring him to a halt as he watched the tracker. She knelt, pressing a palm to the earth. "Something's close!" From atop Tal's back, the runesmith drew a spyglass from her belt, extending the brass tube and looking through it. "Riders ahead," she confirmed, "and they aren't Noxian." Erath looked, seeing two tiny figures crested the top of a hill. He was able to make out that they were on horseback. His pulse quickened, and his hand fell to the leather-worn haft of the short falchion at his hip. After so long on the road, day after day of monotony, the prospect of a skirmish was refreshingly welcome. "Second, third," Errol called, and the two Drakehound leapt forward. "Wait," said Tifalingi, now looking behind them. "There's more." Erath turned, seeing more figures appear behind them, and then to either side. He barely heard the sharp note of a horn as they descended the hill towards them. "Raiders!" Tifalingi drew the rune sword on her back. "Form a circle, now!" The ground began to shake, soft at first, but steadily climbing to a thunder as the horsemen charged. Erath turned to Tals, trying to find some means to root him to the ground in the case the basilisk panicked and recoiled. As Tifalingi struck him across the head, "Focus!" she hissed. Erath forgot Tals, pulling his falchion and gripping it tightly. He distanced himself from Auril and the runesmith, trying to cover his third of the tiny perimeter they made. The raiders were in full view now, lightly armored with billowing cloaks and teal banners streaming from the tips of barbed lances. The Noxian breached for the charge. Emerald fire lit the runes along Tifalingi's blade. Aril's hounds howled. At the last second, the horse peeled to either side, sprinting in a circle around them. The dust kicked up by their iron-shoed hooves grew into a thick, wielding curtain, rising to cut them off from the world. Erath could just barely make the silhouettes whipping around them. The air whistled, and Erath leapt to one side. A lance embedded itself where he'd just been standing. He heard Auril bark a command, and one of the hounds leapt into the dust. Tifalingi began chanting, the words hurting Erath's ears as worms of green light shivered across the blade. "Zeradesh!" she roared, slashing with the blade, sending a wave of jade lightning through the wall. Erath couldn't tell if she hit anything, if Auril's hound still were alive. Everything was chaos. Noise. A keening wail split the air. The cyclone caging them shuddered. Erath heard something rip, and leapt back as a jet of dark blood burst from the wall of dust, coating his face and chest with hot crimson. He stood there. "Help them, you idiot!" The dust began to settle, and Erath summoned his courage. He focused on the shadow directly ahead of him and charged, with falcon raised and the death cry of his tribe on his lips. He sprinted through the stinging grit, and as he opened his eyes, he found what stood before him was no horse. Whatever it was, its rider had a glaive at his throat in an instant. Now," came a voice, smooth and cultured. "My dear steed feasted well today, but she may yet have room for more." The spear tip lifted Erath's jaw, and he followed it up to the speaker. She was a tall, thin woman, her face hidden behind a mask of iron and black leather. A Noxian banner hung from her glaive, while a second, tattered standard Erath didn't recognize was gathered around her shoulder like a cloak. She rode confidently upon a lithe bipedal creature, all sleek muscle and lashing tails, somewhere between a lizard and a bird. Its vicious visard bared its blood-stained fang in challenge. The dust had cleared now, revealing the dead raiders around them in various states of dismemberment. Erath felt a penetrating gaze from behind the mask, studying him. Her eyes narrowed in amusement as she dipped her glaive to the dead raider, cutting his banner free with a flick of her wrist. Only then did he see the others dangling from her mount as Tifalingi and Auril approached. "Auril, you icy Carnard!" the Noxian acclaimed, striding out confidently to meet the party. "Where did they dig you out of? Last I heard, you were hunting bounties in that wretched stink pit Zorn." She shivered theatrically. "Like missing teeth, that city. Hideous." "Merit?" Auril said flatly. Erath glanced at Tracker. Even for Auril, that greeting seemed cold, and he saw something different in the steel grey of her eyes. "And who are your friends here?" Merit regarded Erath and Tifalingi. "I find it hard to believe you would just happen to be passing through." "Hail," said Tifalingi, dipping her head in greeting. "Your instincts are true enough. We come in the Empire's service, our mandate." The runesmith handed Merit a scroll. The masked woman unfurled it. Her dark eyes flickered up to regard Tifalingi several times as she read it.
under penalty of death.
Merritt read dramatically, before handing the scroll back to Tifalengi.
Well, this all seems to be in order. When do we leave?
Now, answered Tifalengi.
Fair enough.
Merritt eyed Erath.
Manservant, eh?
He hesitated. I'm a blade squire.
You may address me as my lady, manservant.
Merritt gestured to a mount.
And this is the glorious steed, the Lady Henrietta Eliza Vespucian IV of Orogondis.
She looked at Erath, narrowing her eyes.
But you do appear quite stupid, so I suppose just Henrietta will suffice.
Henrietta swung her long muscular neck in Erath's direction, breathing out a chittering hiss through her gleaming fangs. What does she eat? Erath asked.
People who get on my nerves,
said Merritt, as she turned away towards the pavilion.
Tend to her inns, little man, and speak when spoken to.
Erath opened his mouth to reply, but Henrietta hissed again, and he bit down on his anger. Together, they worked quickly, striking Merritt's camp and loading it onto Tal's. The basilisk bore the weight easily, as though it didn't even notice the added burden. Erath was beginning to understand how a fully grown one could level a fortification.
Is everything ready to move?
Asked the runesmith. Erath nodded, and she signaled them to move. Merritt leapt up into a polished leather saddle on Henrietta's back, binding the Noxian banner to her glaive and the second standard around her neck like a cloak. Come on then, Tals, Erath called, urging the basilisk from where it drank and munched on the soft grass of the watering ground. Merritt cocked her head to one side.
Wait, did he name our pack animal?
He did, said Errol. Merritt scoffed.
Well, I suppose we can use the idiot's tear to season the meat when we have to eat it on the trail.
Those riders, said Tifalengi, nodding in the direction where she had watched them vanish over the horizon.
Yes.
Merritt leaned down from her saddle.
What about them? Aren't you concerned they'll simply go back to Reading in your absence?
Merritt waved her hand.
Nonsense! These are my ancestral lands. If they choose to be good stewards of them, then fine. And if they don't, I'll just kill them all when I return. Rory gives you frown lines.
A few days' ride took them from the Blood Cliffs. The runesmith kept their pace brisk, having the party sleep in shift along the trail and only stopping when absolutely necessary. Erath saw her each night, either on the road or at the camp sitting apart from the others, with her eyes intent on the moon. They skirted east across the base of low mountains before arriving at the port of the call at the Dragon Gate. At first light of dawn, Erath found the docks there to be just as bustling as any others, mired in the same organized chaos of armies mobilizing that seems to be taking place over the entirety of eastern coast of Noxus. Thousands of warriors and countless armorers, cooks, builders, menders, priests, and forgesmiths that attend to them, filled into the holds of great troop ships ready to unfurl immense crimson sails and dip their oars for the voyage across the sea. Erath set about hunting supplies as soon as they arrived, while the ships were already provisioned for soldiers and more common animals for their crossing. Their party had accumulated a variety of exotic creatures he was now responsible for. Luckily for Erath, the mandate the runesmith carried granted them swift passage through the congested queues and overruled any of the more obstinate quartermasters. Before midday, they were ready to board.
There, Tifalengi pointed towards the docks. That is our ship, the Ionia.
Erath's eyes fell upon the vessel. The Ionia was a troop carrier, unmistakably Noxian design, from the strong lines of dark iron plating to the tightly bound red sails, eager to unleash and carry the ship forward onto the waves. The largest boat he had ever embarked upon was the river skiff that had borne his tribe to the Immortal Bastion, and comparing that to the Ionia was like comparing a toothpick to a battle axe. Lines of men and women were already boarding, filling up gangplanks, while other wider rams admitted animals and pallets of tools, stone, and lumber.
I don't see many soldiers, said Erath. We'll be traveling with mostly laborers and stonemasons, said Tifalengi. The Anatonian is bound for Felor, not the main islands.
Felor? Erath glared at the runesmith. We go to the great fortress then. What's left of it, muttered Errol. Word has reached as far as Dalamor of the tragic of Felor. Erath had gathered with his tribe around a fire as the shaman relayed how a cowardly band of Ionians had assaulted the Noxian fortress there. In their desperation, they had unleashed magic that was beyond their power to control, wreaking horrific damage to the defenses there. A fortnight later, the tribe had received the call to carry their spears to the capital. all of their spears. "We embark," said Tifalingi. She pointed at a white access point. "Take the beast and get them aboard, Blade Squire." Erath dipped his head, looking over at Errol. "Shall I take the hounds as well?" All 4 Drake hounds glared at Erath. They somehow managed to snarl at him in the exact same pitch at the exact same time. A chorus of angry jaws. "They will remain with me." Errol snapped a finger, and the pack fell silent. Erath gathered up the reins for Tals. Merritt handed over the reins to Henrietta, favoring her steed with a final caress down her jawline. "Make sure the good lady has her own accommodation," called Merritt as Erath led the beast towards the ship. "If you put anything else in with her, she'll be alone soon enough." The open air was cold and sharp with salt spray. 12 other ships sailed beside the Anatolian in the squadron, their red sails full and taut with a generous wind that at least for now handled the duty of the oarsmen below deck. Gossip aboard amongst board soldiers had spread the rumors that they had passed through pirate routes at some point the previous night, though few of them could imagine any corsair fool enough to try their luck against a dozen Imperial warships packed from bow to stern with war-edgy killers. Erath turned from looking out across the squadron as Errol approached, nearly saluting before remembering he had been told not to. Errol ignored the awkwardness. She glanced down, noticing how tightly the boy held onto the railing. "Your first passage?" The Blade Squire nodded. 3 days at sea, and still another 3 they say, until we get to Farlor. He waved a hand at the endless span of churning grey waves stretching all the way to the horizon, broken only by the salt-shrouded shapes of the other warships. "I never thought there could be so much water." Errol grunted, non-committal. "You were in the war before," Erath said, uneasy with the subject. "Ionia, what is it like?" Errol did not answer him at once. The tracker stared out over the ocean, reaching down to scratch the sleek, leathery skin behind Second's bony crest mask. She breathed slowly. "It is a place of beauty and death." "All of Ionia is just one giant jungle raptor with its head cut off." Merritt appeared from behind them, strutting forward to lounge against the railing. "We decapitated it last time, and now it's just thrashing about, making a mess, too stupid to realize it's already dead." "I've hunted raptors," said Errol, "and even headless they can still gut you." "So it is war then?" asked Erath. "Another war with Ionia?" Merritt shrugged. "Damned if I know, but the Grand General sure shoved a lot of boots across the ocean just to rattle swords. Just hope he has enough backbone to let us finish what we start this time." Errol walked away, and Erath looked back at the fathomless expanse of the gently crashing waves. "What is the name of this ocean?" he asked. "Who cares what it's called?" Merritt leaned over Erath's shoulder before she stalked off. "It's ours." Erath had never been so grateful to see dry land. The fortress of Farlor grew in size and definition on the horizon before them. The Etonian had made speed in her voyage to the island, but Erath had discovered he was far from suited for a life on the seas. The heaving, rolling motion of their warship had stolen many meals from his stomach, offered to the ocean in a queasy tribute of abrupt sickness. Everything was soaked, coated in a crackling crust of salt that burned his skin. He had kept below deck for the most part, ensuring that the creatures in his care endured the passage with as much comfort as he was able to offer. Tal seemed fine, eating regularly and spending the majority of time in his pen, sleeping. Lady Henrietta, however, had required more diligent attention. A nimble and energetic beast, Mary's steed was clearly unhappy with the confines of the ship. Erath took extra care during her feeding to ensure he did not become the meal himself, and looked forward to getting Henrietta off the Etonian where she could stretch her legs. When the call for land had gone out from the scouts at the ship's bow, Erath hurried above deck to see. The top deck was crowded with Noxians, eager for their own view. At first, it was a little more than a smudge in the distance, faintly more defined than the hazy stripe where the water met the sky, but the closer they came, the more distinct it grew. Erath glimpsed what appeared to be banks of fog surrounding the island, tainted a ruddy brown that upon closer inspection became red. Farlor was surrounded by Noxian ships. There were concentric circles of vessels ringing the island, defense pickets that were constantly shifting. The Etonian was halted by the outmost patrols, a pair of frigates that lashed themselves to the larger vessels with boarding hooks as squads of naval soldiers came aboard. Erath noted their stern countenances as they inspected the troop ship. Weapons in hand, they pored over the captain's mandate and manifest. They scoured every deck, and the Blade Squire watched as a trio of robed blood mages studied every soldier aboard, softly chanting as they looked every man and woman in the eye. "What are they looking for, mistress?" he asked Tifalinchi. "Signs of subterfuge," replied the runesmith. "Deception, wild magic." To Erath, it all seemed strange, but we are all Noxian soldiers on an Imperial ship. Does this not seem paranoid? "Patience, boy," said Tifalinchi. "When we dock at Phalor, you will understand." After they had been over every inch of the Etonian, a contingent of soldiers remained aboard while the others returned to their frigate, and the ship was cleared to advance to the next ring of the blockade. The inspection and checks repeated with each checkpoint, the guard details rotating each time the Etonian was stopped. Erath had been poked, prodded, and scrutinized so many times that when they finally had the harbor in sight, he questioned whether any of his own comrades trusted him, or anyone for that matter. And then he got a better look at Phalor and understood why. The fortress had been gutted. He could make out only echoes of the great rampart that had once stood at its heart, the formerly impregnable fortification reduced to shattered remnants that rose from the ground like blackened, broken teeth. But the extent of the devastation went far beyond the walls and towers. The very land itself was broken open, torn apart and ripped out, bearing all the hallmarks of some incredible natural disaster. The Etonian drew up to her berth, and Noxian leapt to work both aboard and on the docks as soon as she came to a halt. Craftsmen rushed out to their assigned post, while raw material and supplies were offloaded and taken ashore. Erath went below deck, trying to put the shock of the island from his mind as he went about getting Tals and Henrietta off the Etonian. Standing out against the herds of livestock and more mundane pack animals, Erath led his beast up a wide ramp leading from the ship's hold. Waiting as those ahead of him were processed and allowed into Phalor, he stood transfixed as he watched a crew descend over the wreckage of another warship like a swarm of furious ants. Great winches and chains hurled the wreck up out of the water, a piece at a time. Teams scrambled down within, pulling out the pale, bloated shapes of the fallen in droves. She was more than twice the tonnage of the Etonian, and her hull had been broken in two like a stick over a man's knee. What kind of power could have possibly done such a thing? Erath thought back to when he stood in the shadow of the Immortal Bastion, the certainty he felt there, seeing the Empire marching to war, that there was nothing in creation that could possibly stand against them. For the first time, seeing what had befallen to Phalor with his own eyes, he felt doubt creep into his heart. Finally, he reached the end of the ramp, stepping from soaked wood onto cracked rock. The air was thick, humid, and dusty. It smelled of spice, things Erath couldn't place as he realized, at long last, that he was there. This was Ionia. Erath lost track of how long he was standing there, or how the letter of Henrietta's reins was sliding through his fingers. By the time he was aware of it, Merritt's mount was sloping into the camp. "Hey!" The Blade Squire started to pursue her, before looking back at Tals. "Stay," he warned, drawing his knife and pinned the basilisk reins to the ground with it, before sprinting after Henrietta. "Whoa!" he called to the roving Syrian as she stalked between the lines of billet tents. She stopped, her long neck swirling to regard Erath. Henrietta hissed at him through the gleaming metal of her chanfron, what Merritt called her jewelry. Enclosing her face and skull, it was part protective helm, part weapon, accumulating her already vicious fangs with sharpened iron blades. "Easy, my lady," Erath coaxed, arms wide as he slowly closed the distance between them. "Easy now." "Control that thing!" bellowed a voice from a group nearby. Both Henrietta and the Blade Squire shot him a hostile glare. "She's been cooped up in a ship for days," Erath barked at the soldier. He took advantage of Henrietta's diverted attention and grabbed hold of the reins, wrapping the leather around his forearm. "She'd need exercise. You want to beat? Then stay out of the way." Erath stared down the soldiers and watched them disperse, only registering after a time that the runesmith was calling for him. He went back to gather up Tal's reins and guided his charges along, tossing the basilisk forward and holding Henrietta back as he headed towards where Tifalinchi waited with Errol and Merritt. He saw new tension in the runesmith's companions as he approached, a tightness in their posture that hadn't been there before. "Take your time," Merritt sneered, snatching Henrietta's reins from Erath. Errol squatted down, fingers brushing over the rubble strewn over the ground as the drakehound orbited her. "This was old magic," muttered the tracker. "Something long sleeping, now roused."
Where did you learn to sense magic? Merritt asked, a skeptical eyebrow.
Here,
Errol answered, barely above a whisper. Oh joy, replied Merritt. She glanced at Tifalenchi expectantly. Well, the last member of our expedition is here, at Phalor, the Runesmith replied. We simply need to find her.
Just look for a dueling pit, said Errol. She won't be far from the scent of blood.
Erath nodded, growing accustomed to gleaning what he could from inferences and cryptic words. Does she have a beast I am to care for as well? Oh, manservant. Merritt shook her head. Tenef, she is the beast. Errol was right. While Phalor was in the midst of its reconstruction, it still remained a Noxian military camp. They followed the sound of ringing steel, sharper than the rhythm coming from the forge's hammers, leading them to where the warriors on the island trained. Past rows of billet tents, they would dug a series of shallow pits, each of them occupied by a pair of dueling soldiers. With blunted sword, wooden staffs, or bare hands, they sparred, but one in particular had attracted a crowd. The party had to muscle their way through the watching soldiers to catch a glimpse into the pit. Two Noxians circled each other in full warplate, one wielding a training sword and a buckler, the other a heavy iron hook mounted on a length of chain. The soldiers watching cheered the pairs as they measured distance and exchanged finds. The swordman sensed an opening. He lunged forward, flinging his buckler into his opponent's face while slashing low with his sword. The other fighter leapt back, just shy of the blade, while throwing her hooked chain to ensnare the man's shield arm. She whipped her arm down, raising the swordman forward into a brutal headbutt. He dropped to a mere like a stone, blood spraying from a ruined nose. That's first blood to me, she crowed. The onlookers erupted in cheers. That was dirty, Tenef, the swordman snarled, pouring blood from his masked nose with a wicked laugh. Let's make it second blood. I'm not done with you yet. First blood was the agreement, Tenef repeated, with no compromise in her voice. We need you in the line, says Tus. The swordman barked out a swear and stood, trudging up out of the pit. Tenef wound her chain around her forearm, looking up to find Erath and the party staring down at her, her eyes widening in confusion. Merritt? Errol? Merritt chuckled. Still cracking skulls, eh, Ten? Tenef spat a gobble of phlegm onto the ground. Some of us never stopped, she said with a grin, taking the hand Errol offered her to pull her out of the pit. Erath backed out of the way as she climbed out. Tenef bore the hallmarks of a shield breaker, a warrior of the line at home when her enemies was within arm's reach. Scars crisscrossed any flesh not covered in leather and iron armor, tales of blood and honor etched into her over a lifetime of battle. He wondered how many of the scars she bore were earned here in Ionia. The last time I saw either of you, said Tenef, we were all here, said Merritt. Quiet descended between the soldiers for a few moments. There was a bond between them. Erath could see that clearly, but there was a void there as well, something unspoken, or even missing. He had lived around soldiers long enough to know not to prod. Well, said Tenef, breaking the silence, if you're all coming from Valoran, then you've been eating ship slops for days. Our cook are no artists, but they're a damn sight better than that. Come! The sun began to sink into the horizon, painting the skies in dappled bands of gold, orange, and scarlet, drifting down into indigo. They made their way through the massed tents and then found seats around a fire as the air started to chill. The women talked among themselves of what they had done since last they served beside each other, and of the old wounds they endured together. Erath remained silent and listened. And you, boy, said Tenef, her attention shifting to the blade squire. You blooded? Fought your principal yet? Erath straightened. I served my principal, yes. Her aspect became serious, analytic. Where? It was a border skirmish, west of Dalamor Plains, Erath answered. A quick action, pretty light. He looked to each of them, seeing that his answer had not been enough. This was not the ignorant voyeurism of a civilian, eager to satisfy some fanciful idea of what it was like to fight in a war they would never experience. These were veteran warriors who may find themselves beside him in the line, needing to know what he had seen and how he had carried himself. It was a shallow expansion through a fertile valley, he continued. They were big boys, farming stock, but they were brought up to till the soil, not turn it red. Once we got within a rapid drumbeat, running charge, we closed, rolling up their right side, double fast. Opened them up quite quickly. Any of them left afterward? Asked Errol. To till that soil? Erath shook his head. We tried. After the elders came around,
We brought in others to help them take up the work. Harvest needed planting. No time to wait. Merritt tilted her head.
And how many of those big farm boys did you make the soil red with, eh? Leave it alone, said Tifalinchi.
I was a rear guard, Erath shook. By the time the lines rotated to me, they were already broken. We mostly just finished off those who was too wounded to save and dug graves. The memory surfaced in Erath's mind without asking, trudging through the aftermath of a broken shield wall, feeling someone taking a hold of his ankle, looking down, seeing a man who had taken a spear thrust to the belly, croaking at him in words he did not know, but a message he understood clear enough. Putting his spear tip to the man's throat, the man tilted his head back, accepting it. When was this? Asked Tinnef. This past spring, Erath answered.
An infant!
Exclaimed Merritt.
I said leave it alone,
the runesmith growled.
He's here to tend the beast, nothing more.
Merritt chuckled, her eyes narrowing in amusement. Tinnef eyed Tifalinchi. What of you then, Rune Shaper? Where have you served?
Far from here, she answered, and the odd light in her eyes convinced Erath that that was as much they would hear of her experience.
Sleeping was a glorious thing to a soldier. Any span of uninterrupted rest was precious, rivaling a full belly or a pair of well-made boots to a fighting man or woman. Erath had tried to adjust to the endless rolling and pitching of the Ionian, but sleep had only come to him in fits and starts. Back on solid ground, with his cloak laid out on a flat, dry patch near the animal pens and his duties done, the Blade Squire rested his head against his pack and savoured the prospect of sleeping through the next handful of hours before the early morning feeding came. It felt as though he had no more than blinked before he heard the voice, sharp and cold as the edge of the knife he felt against his neck.
Do as I say in Silent, or I will cut your throat.
Erath's eyes opened. Dawn's light was still hours away. The moon, a thin silver sickle overhead as he was jerked to his feet. His knife had been taken. They walked Erath carefully to keep his movement slow and his hand in views as he was led to the edge of the camp. A huddle of figures stood ahead. He heard the low snarling of hounds as they approached. The silhouette materialized into Errol and Merritt with the kneeling figure of the runesmith between them. What are you doing in Ionia, boy? Demanded the voice as Erath was shoved to his knees beside Tifalinchi. He was alert enough to recognize the voice behind him as Tinnef's.
He knows nothing,
said Tifalinchi calmly. Tinnef lifted her knife from Erath's throat and rounded it upon the runesmith. And what do we know about you, eh? Tinnef looked to her fellow veterans. Document can be forged, mandates concocted.
My mandate is quite generate,
said Tifalinchi, her calm eerie to Erath.
As is the power you are flirting with opposing.
Merritt tilted her head.
Does the boy even know who you say you're hunting? Who you would have us hunt? He knows what had been necessary for him to know, and nothing more.
Then perhaps it's time he knew. Tinnef looked down at Erath. You seek a ghost, a warrior who died in honor as a hero to Noxus, our comrade. She gestured to Errol and Merritt, our sister.
She lives,
said the runesmith. Lies, Tinnef hissed. Tell me why I should believe a word from your mouth and not kill you right here.
Because the power to which I answer do not make those mistakes. If they say she lives, then she lives. You all serve alongside her in service of the Empire. Now the Empire commands that we find her and bring her back to them. My authority supersedes that of the garrison here. They do not know of our task, nor shall they. What proof do you have of any of this? Demanded Merritt.
Her blade, Tifalinchi sighed. The woman stiffened. What of it? Hissed Tinnef.
Did you know she tried to destroy it? Asked the runesmith.
She drew in a deep breath, and her eyes pulsed emerald.
She failed, and the magic that infused it cried out in desecration. My master heard it, and they saw who was responsible, as clearly as if they were standing in the room with her. That is how we know.
If she yet lives, said Tinnef, then she is a deserter, the very crime you now ask us all to commit, the punishment for which is death. Tifalinchi met Tinnef's withering gaze.
Succeed in this task, aid me in hunting her down and return her for judgment in Noxus, and no censure will befall you. Look into yourself, and all you have sacrificed in this place, and tell me that the treason does not wound you. Tell me you would turn your back on seeing justice done, and the wayward answer for the life she had led these past years.
A dark silence hung over the gathering. Tension radiated from Tinnef, Merritt, and Errol, the threat of violence balancing on a knife's edge. Errol fought his nerves, The simmering rage of secrets and the idea he may die here, on Phalor, with no inkling at all to why. "We will go with you." All eyes fell on Errol, her first words since Erath had been brought to them. Merritt rounded on the tracker. "You speak for all of us now?" "I do," Errol said flatly. She cleared her throat, the effort sounded almost pain to Erath. "Because we're soldiers, all of us, and soldiers does their duty. But more than that, she was a sister to us, and sisters deserve answers." Merritt glared at Errol, her dark eyes slits of intensity, but she relented. "Answers," she repeated. Teneth gritted her teeth, looking to the other veterans who gave her a solemn nod. She hurled the runesmith to her feet by her collar, but did not release her. "At the first inkling that what you have told us here are lies, which I will take your head." "I speak only truth," answered Tifalengi, "and more now that we can tarry no longer than we already have. We must cross into the heart of the First Land, and we must do so now." Tifalengi looked at Erath for the first time now. "What I have said to them bears the same truth to you, Blade Squire. Go with us along this path, attend and serve, and you will be rewarded." "I am a loyal warrior of Noxus," Erath proclaimed. "I do my duty, and need not shadowy promises or threat of a slit throat to do it. The Empire bids I serve you, so I do. I only ask one question." Tifalengi regarded Erath soberly. "Ask it." "Who is it?" asked Erath. "Who are we hunting?" The runesmith drew her sword. "She may call herself something different now, some adopted name for her new life in the First Land." The runes Erath had watched her etch along the blade leapt from the iron into the sky, like a trail leading off into the dark mystic land that loomed ahead of them. But in Noxus, her name was Riven. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the Sisterhoods of War, Part 1, Old Wounds, by Ian St. Martin. Now, this is a little bit interesting. So first of all, this means that the second invasion of Ionia from Noxus side has begun. We also get to know that Riven was part of the Sisterhood of Warriors, existing of her, Riven, Merritt, Errol, and Teneth. Though this story tells a lot about how Noxus work, there's a few things that never get cleared up in this story. First of all, Erath. Who is proud of him, as his tribe leader said in the beginning of the story? And also Tifalengi. Who is she actually working for? Now, I have a theory about Tifalengi. I believe Tifalengi is working for the Black Rose, aka Under the Blank, and since the Blank is one of the 3 leaders of Noxus, that will make sense why her mandate was so high standing and could just overrule almost anyone else. It's gonna be interesting to see where this Sisterhood of War series will take us, but if you want to figure that out, I suggest to subscribe, because as soon as it's out, you can be damn sure I'm covering it. And for the next story on this channel, we're going back to Freljord, because Sujani just got a new color story, and you can be damn sure I'm gonna cover Sujani then. That is hopefully gonna be out around the end of this week. But until next time, enjoy.